Welcome back to the second part of the introduction lecture. So there are a couple general topics I'd like to discuss in this section of the lecture. The first is the very important question today that's discussed all around the world. Should there be an international treaty requiring that artwork and other cultural artifacts be returned to their country of origin? Now, most Americans who've been raised in the U.S. look with some reverence upon the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and other sort of fundamental documents to our country. And some of you may have seen them. You can actually go and see the originals of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. If you go in the middle of the summer, you might stand in line for 2 hours, and they're right there, remarkably well preserved under some kind of bulletproof, bomb-proof glass, but you can clearly read them. The question is, how would many Americans respond if some wealthy individual or country decided to buy them, legally buy them? I think people would be outraged in the U.S. Most people would be outraged. But that's an example to try and give you an idea of how people feel emotionally about this. And we'll have a few examples here in a minute. Well, a couple of years ago, I was having breakfast and flipping through the Costco monthly magazine. I think most of you know Costco is a big box store, sort of like Walmart. And if you're a member, you get a monthly magazine. And every month they have an article, sort of interesting in the Costco magazine of all places, but they have an article presenting two sides of an issue. And they're typically pretty light topics, such as, well, do you think people's clothing is getting too informal in the workplace? Or, should kids have strict limits on how much time they can spend on electronics, things like that. But lo and behold, having my bowl of cereal, I came across the article, which I have. It's only 2 pages, and I scanned it, and a PDF copy is in this module, and you definitely want to read it. And the title is, Should Art and Artifacts Be Returned to the Country of Origin? And it's basically has a half page written by one professor of the classics who said, yes, there should be an international obligation. And then a professor of philosophy says, no, there shouldn't be such a requirement. And then the magazine, you can go to their website and let them know which side you agree with. And so I went to their website, and lo and behold, 2/3 of the people who read the article and bothered to vote in this survey said, yes, there should be an international requirement that all pieces of art be returned to their country of origin. Now, obviously, this is not a scientific survey or poll, because not everybody in the world, in the United States, gets Costco magazine. Not everybody who does get the magazine would read the article and then bother to go and vote online. But what it does show is, at least it's a topic interesting enough to be put in a sort of a mass circulation magazine. It's more, if you've seen the Costco magazine, it's more articles on new products and things. So be sure you understand this topic. There will be one multiple choice exam question in general on this topic. So if you read that article, follow the next few slides, you'll get it right. And by the way, I like to give people heads up as to what will be on the exam, because frankly, there is an overwhelming amount of material in this course. Once we get into the substance of the course, the readings, the videos, the lectures, You can't possibly be expected to remember everything. And also, the exams as well as the quizzes are all open note, open book, but that doesn't really help students who have no idea what they're doing and they haven't studied. So again, there's less emphasis just on rote memorization. So this is an interesting discussion. Let's look at it for a moment, and please read that 2-page article. I think you'll find it of interest. And then there is a discussion question in the module on this very topic, where I encourage you to say what you think. And you can also look at what others say, and if you want, you can respond, put your thoughts in. I welcome polite disagreements with emphasis on polite, being professional. You'll see that there's a very good TED video on 10 ways to have a better conversation. That's how to discuss things that are controversial. I've also uploaded and put on the module a 2-page handout on how to speak professionally in meetings or in classrooms. And I suggest that you keep this for life. I'm not joking. Keep this for life for your career, because when you're in a meeting in your professional careers, and I don't care if you're a nurse, you're an engineer, in business, whatever you're doing, you're going to be in meetings and you want to express a different view than someone else. Well, there are ways to do it. You just don't say, oh, you stupid idiot, what a dumb idea. You want to come out, and there's some good phrases there, like, I see your point, but I think I see it differently, something like that. So be sure and look at those. I think it will help you in your career. So let's look at this issue of, should cultural objects be required to be returned to their country of origin? Now, this is a topic that, in my view, has very good, valid arguments on both sides. That's why, for instance, in the Costco magazine article, you'll see 2 distinguished professors sort of take opposite sides. Some considerations are, how was the art object or cultural artifact? Cultural artifact is not like just a painting, it includes more. So was it a result of imperialism, one army taking over another country, particularly in the days of colonies, such as which we will see later in the course happened often in Greece and Rome, in Greece and Egypt, and also some extent in Italy. Was it a grave robber? A grave robber would be, as the name suggests, someone who literally breaks into a grave and steals things. We'll see in the course there was a lot of that in ancient Egypt. And in fact, King Tutankhamun, famous King Tut, his grave is so famous because it was discovered in the 1920s, and it's the only pharaoh's grave that hadn't been broken into. So many thousands of years ago, I mean, this happened thousands of years ago, grave robbers broke into the tombs of the pharaohs, including in the Great Pyramids, as we'll see later in the course, and stole all the precious objects that were there, and they're floating around in private art collections and museums around the world. Should those objects be required to go back to Egypt? What about something in the private art market? Something legitimately sold. Many artists in recent, last century or 150 years ago, many of the famous impressionists such as Vincent van Gogh and others voluntarily sold their artwork to customers in other countries. And those pieces of art are worth tens of millions of dollars now, some of them hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, should the owners be required to return them to France because that's where they were painted, even though they were legally acquired at the time? Now, some people will argue, well, more people can see these works of art in museums. So if we have, Egyptian mummies all around the world, if you want to see a real Egyptian mummy, here in Houston, go to the Museum of Natural Science. On the top floor, they have a beautiful Egyptian gallery. Should those mummies be required to go back to Egypt? And there's some other objects there at the same time. People argue it's also, you go to a museum and you can see similar works of art from other countries, not mummies, but you can see different types of paintings and all, and compare them. A very real concern is, having the objects removed from their country and in a museum somewhere else protects them from destruction by mobs or governments. I've got some slides of this in a few minutes, and I'll show you in China and what's happening the last few years in Iraq and Syria. An argument is also old works of art, whether they're paintings or shoes made hundreds of years ago, textiles, need protection from heat, humidity. And there's, in some of the poor countries in the world, the argument goes they don't have the proper museums, nor do they have good security systems to protect them. And I'm just going through the slide. More people can see them in museums around the world. Of course, people argue, like in the Egyptians and the Greeks say all these works of art that are in museums, particularly in Paris, in the Louvre, in the British Museum in London, or the New York Art Museum, these are part of our heritage, our national, our cultural identity in Greece and Egypt as people, and it belongs here. So you can see on both sides there are some valid arguments that can be made, and just a few arguments on the slides, and then the Costco article has a few more. Turning to China, this is a photo. The Cultural Revolution, you recall, I'm sure, from your studies of world history, the late 1940s, the Chinese communists took control of China, and Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists were pushed into the island of Formosa or Taiwan. Well, in the 1960s, in an effort to sort of purify Chinese communism, they had the famous Cultural Revolution, in which virtually any remnant of classical China was destroyed because it wasn't communist, because communism obviously didn't exist. And here we have going into temples, Buddhist temples, destroying monuments. Here we have all over China, if they weren't totally destroyed, they were defaced with hammers and things. Even Confucius's tomb out in the countryside was destroyed. The libraries in China, all the Chinese classics, all that they could find were burned. So some people would argue, well, the objects of Chinese art that weren't in China at that time were not destroyed. And some of those have been taken by Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists to what's now Taiwan. Others were in museums around the world. So that's the sort of mob action. This is in London in the British Museum, the original of the Egyptian Rosetta Stone, which we'll talk about extensively later in the course. But the Rosetta Stone is this black rock you see in the bulletproof, bomb-proof case there, which has the key, contained the key to deciphering or the ancient Egyptian writing system, so-called hieroglyphics, because you have hieroglyphics and then you also the same text in ancient Greek. And with this stone, which was found about 200 years ago, they were able, finally, people were able to read the many, many hieroglyphics of classical Egypt. This is the original, and the Egyptians very much want it back. They say it's part of their cultural heritage. The reason the English have it is the French actually found it. They were doing some construction work, and I'll talk more about this later in the course. But then a few years later, by coincidence, the Egyptians defeated the French and took over Egypt, and nobody could really figure out what was in the stone yet, but the English army determined that it was of value and sent it back to the British Museum, where it's been ever since. This is a major, major issue. If any of you are Egyptian or have any Egyptian friends, ask them what they think about the Rosetta Stone being in London. It would be as if our Declaration of Independence and Constitution were in Tokyo because the US government, well, that would be different if we had sold it, but because this was taken a long time ago. Okay, Greece, one of the most famous buildings in the world from antiquity, probably the most famous, is the Parthenon. Again, we'll talk about this in great detail later. But a British nobleman by the name of Lord Elgin financed an expedition which went and studied the Parthenon and the statues, and Lord Elgin brought back to the British Museum, which was paying for this also, half of this. These are all the statues that line the walls, or half the walls of the Parthenon on the interior, and they're in London. And the Egyptians very, very much want those back. At first, the British Museum argued they weren't safe in Britain, and so the Egyptian government has constructed a beautiful museum the Greek government has constructed a beautiful museum near the Parthenon, and they've made a room just like this with air conditioning, heat, great security, and said, we're all set, send back the marbles. And the British Museum has essentially said no. Now, I mentioned mob action. You also have terrorists. The Islamic State is recognized by the European Union, the United States, and many other countries as a terrorist group. And one thing they've been doing last few years is destroying many, many remnants of previous cultures and civilizations because they were not considered revolutionary enough. So these are people literally going with big sledgehammers and destroying priceless works of art. Here they are in a museum, and this has happened largely in Syria and Iraq, and destroying works of art. And the argument goes, in countries where you can have such mob action, it makes sense to have at least some of the works of art safe in other museums. So this has been very controversial for a number of decades. And finally, in 2002, the major museums that have many of these pieces, this would be the British Museum, the Louvre in New York, major US museums in Japan and other countries, came out with a statement. Objects acquired in earlier times must be viewed in the light of different sensitivities and values reflective of that earlier era. Well, in other words, there was imperialism, colonialism. The French and the English controlled Egypt. Well, Egypt wasn't a country then, but what's now Egypt, and took it. And so basically they're saying, we've got them and we're not giving them back. And then the other argument being museums serve not just the citizens of one nation, but the people of every nation. Well, the Egyptian or Greek response to this would be, thank you very much. We want our priceless artifacts back. And if people want to see them, they'd be very welcome to come and spend their money in our country, stay in a nice hotel, and we'd be happy to show them these works of art. So this is 2002, almost 20 years ago, and at that point, the major museums have not changed their position. So if you could, again, read the article from the Costco magazine, provide your thoughts in the discussion, and, I'd love to see a nice discussion there, just as you would in the classroom. You could respond to other people in a thoughtful and professional manner. And to help you along in this, again, I encourage you to watch the video, 10 Ways to Have a Better Conversation. This has had like 20 million views on the internet. It's by a well-known radio host who interviews many people that politically she strongly disagrees with, but rather than just screaming at each other, she talks about how to have a conversation. And then if you read the 2-page article on speaking professionally, and this be the same thing in writing, if you're responding to someone you disagree with, you can say, well, thank you for your views. I understand your points, but I see it differently, blah, blah, blah. And this leads to another topic I'd like to talk about for 4 or 5 minutes, and then we finish our introduction. And that's the whole value of thinking differently, which is known as cognitive diversity. I mean, we talk a lot about diversity, but there are all kinds of diversities, but one of them is cognitive diversity, very, very important. How people see things differently, think differently. So let's go back a bit in our time machine to the 1990s, early 1990s. And back then, most of you weren't born then, maybe perhaps some of you were, but most of my students are coming right out of high school. And this is the famous IBM ThinkPad. This is one of the first laptops. I believe IBM still makes ThinkPads. They still call them ThinkPads. Well, you can see this. It's kind of bulky. It's, the screen is sort of gray and white. I know many of you were 20 years old and going, oh my God, that's ancient. Well, I remember when that first came out and it was wonderful. I had one and I thought, yeah, this is just awesome. And of course, it has, you see the Windows operating system with folders and files, which was the big, big, big advancement. So that's the IBM ThinkPad. And just a bit of trivia, you probably know this, but you can see, looking at that early laptop computer, on the right side of it, there's a little slot, and that slot is the hold of the floppy disk. It's called a floppy disk because inside the plastic, this is 3.5 inches square, inside the standard floppy disk, inside the case is a little the memory, and this was the computer's memory. If you wanted to give a file to someone else, a document or something, you would save it on that floppy disk, press a button, it would pop out, and you'd go to your friend's house and give them the floppy disk to put in their machine. There was no saving to the cloud. There was really very limited emailing or anything. So look at the floppy disk there. Now look at that symbol. That's still used. This is my PowerPoint software on which I recorded this presentation, and I've circled, that's a floppy disk. I showed that to my youngest kids. They said, oh, they didn't know what that meant. They just knew it meant saved. Well, what it meant was, going back one, it meant, well, I can't go back on this presentation, but it meant a floppy disk. Okay, well, back to thinking differently. So here's IBM, International Business Machines, still a huge company. It's kind of moved more out of home computing. It's mainly large corporate customers. So they had the ThinkPad. Their big logo was Think. This is the entrance to their corporate headquarters outside New York City. Think. Well, just about then, same time, the competition was Apple, Steve Jobs. So Steve Jobs, they came up with their own personal computer for home use. And instead of saying Think, Apple's logo was Think Different. Okay, this is the famous Apple logo of a bite out of an apple. And we all know why Steve Jobs chose the apple as the name of the company. It's because he spent a summer in college working in an apple orchard in Oregon or Washington somewhere. And so he was also, for a year or two of his life at that age, he only ate fruit. I think that's called a fruitarian. Yeah, no vegetables, nothing else, just fruit. I think that's called a fruitarian. Anyway, so he had apples on his mind, obviously. So this is the ad for the Apple, the early Apple Mac. Apple, Think Different. And you can see again in the front where the floppy disk goes in. So Apple's basically saying, think different. Now, I'm sure if we were to have a discussion, which we won't, unless you want to, Those of us who use Apple, myself included, would strongly defend them. And those of you who use Microsoft based process computers would come out and strongly argue. I don't think IBM has a significant share of personal computer market now. It may. I know they still sell ThinkPads. So thinking differently, something I encourage you to do in this course and everywhere. Thinking outside the box is the way people talk. That's what you need to do as a professional. And just for a second, I'll talk a little about, in my experience, again, as you saw in part one, I worked for the Department of State in Washington, D.C. for almost 35 years, and in Washington and then overseas. And the organization very, very much encouraged, particularly the last 10 or 15 years, people to speak their minds. There's too much groupthink where people, no one wants to disagree with their boss or anyone else. And in fact, there's an entire system set up. This I pulled off the internet. This was a confidential cable, but it was declassified. And you can see the subject line is Dissent from U.S. Policy Towards Eastern Pakistan. And, I don't know when this was written in the 70s or something. I just pulled it off the internet. So here's someone at our embassy in Pakistan sending in an, not in South Asia, sending in a official report saying they strongly disagreed with the U.S. policy. Now, this is not made public, but in any organization, you want people to disagree. You want them to disagree, and you have to set up channels. And in fact, in the State Department, they had an annual award given by the Secretary of State, along with a check for $10,000, to the person who produced the best dissent on whatever the topic was, because the idea is otherwise everybody becomes the yes man or yes person and just agrees with their boss. A very real example was what happened. You recall in 2003, the U.S. led a number of countries in invading Iraq on the grounds that Iraq had programs to produce and use weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. And this is the cover of what was then the top secret. It's called NIE, National Intelligence Estimate, by all the U.S. intelligence agencies. This goes to the president and other senior people. Basic conclusion was yes, and they're not complying with UN restrictions. We need to take military action. And we all know what happened. The U.S. and other countries invaded, and lo and behold, after a few months, it became apparent there were no weapons of mass destruction. I won't go into all the details, but what happened is Iraq did have weapons of mass destruction. There's no question in the 1980s, early 1990s, they had used them, well documented, particularly chemical weapons against Iran in their 10, 15-year war. They had used them within Iraq against the Kurdish minority population. But then nobody really realized it. Our intelligence agencies didn't, nor did the Europeans, that Saddam Hussein had secretly destroyed them. At the same time, he was going around and telling people in the world that he had them. Kind of strange he'd do that, but he did. And so it turned out that the basis for the invasion had, in fact, no basis. So after this came out, a couple years later, the U.S. Senate Committee on Intelligence, both Republicans and Democrats, came out with a report saying, how could this happen? How could professionals, analysts, come out with this totally wrong assessment? And you can get this off the internet. Bits here and there are blacked out where they took out the confidential information, but it's not that important. And, it's a really shocking failure. But for our purposes, what was the problem? Well, it was group think, where everybody thinks the same, right? Group think. This is probably one of the worst things that can happen in any organization, in a company, in a hospital, anywhere, where everybody thinks the same. And what happened, particularly in the case of the weapons of mass destruction, Iraq, is no one really challenged the assumption. Well, everybody knew that Iraq did, in fact, have some weapons of mass destruction. They'd used them. They'd used them in the 80s and early 90s. And so people looked at the evidence and they just connected the dots that shouldn't have been connected. And they said, oh, this is just evidence that they still have weapons of mass destruction, when in fact they didn't. And the question, is now, what don't we know? And well, I know all of you don't have access to CIA intelligence analysis, but there is since the fiasco in 2002, 2003 in Iraq, every single assessment must have a page right at the beginning. What don't we know? And things are like, well, all our information is 10 years old. I mean, that's important to know. You're not dealing, what don't we know? And that's true for any decision you make. People don't have the luxury of knowing everything. And now the CIA, this is the analytical teams, they set up red versus blue teams to challenge. So they'll come up to say to 3 or 4 people, okay, you're the red team, they're the blue team. We want you to challenge every assumption. And then they bring in outside views. They take university professors who may be, for instance, an expert in the Middle East or something, or China. They give them access and they say, we want your thoughts on this. Because, again, groupthink is one of the worst things that can happen, and not just in intelligence analysis, in any organization. Whether it's a hospital looking at how to handle outbreaks of infections or whatever, you want people to challenge assumptions. And in the corporate world now, many, many companies, when they have meetings, they actually tell people in a meeting, you must challenge all of our assumptions. And it puts people in the hot seat, but people have better decisions. And in this context, there's an old saying that changing your mind is not showing your ignorance, it's just saying that you're wiser today than yesterday. Because I don't know about all of you, but I've oftentimes changed my mind. Maybe I didn't have all the information, or I just thought about it differently. And Walter Lippmann, famous writer, once said, if everybody thinks the same, there isn't much thinking going on. Think about that. If you get everybody together and nobody has any different ideas, first of all, it's pretty boring, and then there isn't much thinking going on. In the workplace, you're all in college, going to have professional careers, but this is sort of a takeaway from the course. There won't be anything on the exam on this, but Colin Powell, who was, of course, Secretary of State, he was the most senior leader in the military in the 90s, and you say bad news isn't like wine. It doesn't get better with age. Because he, as a manager, said, I want to know if things aren't going well, if someone thinks something's not going well. Otherwise, we have a disaster. The McKinsey consulting firm, which does consulting with all sorts of major U.S. companies, says within a company, dissent is an obligation, that employees have to be encouraged to express their views if they disagree with something. In the Harvard Business Review, obviously coming out of Harvard Business School, is widely read. And they had a recent article that said, if your team agrees on everything, working together is pointless. Think about that. Everybody agrees. Why do you need to work together? Just have one person do it. So teamwork, we all talk about teamwork. In school, I'm sure you had lots of group work. And this is our traditional view of teamwork. Everybody here is rowing together. Well, clearly, for this example, it's necessary. This is what they call the sport crewing. And, it's an Olympic event, and you have to have, people rowing, they all have to row in unison and whatnot. Otherwise, the boat would go in circles. But that's not the way decisions should be made, with everybody just saying yes, yes, yes. And so when you say someone is open-minded, and I'm sure most of you think that you're open, I hope you do, you're open-minded, you have to admit the possibility that you're wrong. I mean, I feel that myself. I'm pretty convinced of some of my views, but things might be wrong. I'm not talking about black, issues such as, is murder bad? I think everybody would agree murder is bad, things like that. But other topics, not just political, but economic or whatever, you have to admit the possibility that what you're doing is wrong. It's a messy process with a group of people. It leads to tension. It leads to disagreement. And then it also gets to, some conflict, personal levels, because we all, I think, have a natural distaste for conflict. I mean, that's what I don't know about you, but most of my friends more or less have the same views as I do. I don't want to spend all my time with friends arguing and debating things, but it's a little different in the workplace. There you have to have a certain amount of conflict. As I explained earlier in part one, we all have our point of view, and that's basically our bias. And it's the old saying or saw, my religion, your supervision. You've probably heard the expression a devil's advocate. People will sometimes say, well, let me be the devil's advocate. And then they say something totally that disagrees with everyone else or what they're talking about. Well, this is actually, it's fascinating. This is an actual formal position within the Catholic Church, in the headquarters of the Catholic Church in the Vatican. They have someone who has this title. It's in Latin. I forgot what it is in Latin. And this position has existed for 500 years because, as you may know, the Roman Catholic Church has saints, and they have a process of where someone is nominated to be a saint, if you will, and they go through some kind of committee who says, yes, yes, this person did all these wonderful things, and therefore the Pope will declare them to be a saint. And this was done, I don't know when, fairly recently with Mother Teresa of India. Well, the devil's advocate is supposed to sit in that committee meeting and literally come up with reasons why the person shouldn't be declared a saint. So, we're talking about a religious organization. That's why they call it the devil's advocate, because the devil is obviously the bad guy. Satan is the bad guy. So some poor person had to sit there and say, well, Mother Teresa shouldn't be a saint for this or that reason. What I've read, she was a pretty nice person, but, But this is necessary whenever you're having a group make a decision. And in a meeting or something, or in a classroom, you can ask someone to be the devil's advocate. Challenge everybody. Challenge. How do you know that? Why are you saying that? And it's best to make sure everybody serves this role. So if you have a group of 6 people in a committee, I don't care if it's a committee at school, wherever it is, they take turns. So everybody has that uncomfortable role, and they challenge everything. Another way to reduce conflict is depersonalize conflicting ideas. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when people are talking in a group or situation or one-on-one, if you disagree with someone, the other person probably gets emotional, particularly if you get to something that may involve their values, like, their religious beliefs, their strongly held political or economic beliefs, or whatever. And as soon as you do that, communication pretty much stops, and you can see people getting red and people start screaming, whatever, and there's no communication. So one effective way is to bring in an imaginary third person. And, instead of saying, well, I think blah, 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 you can say, well, I read an article that said blah, blah, blah. Then the person you're talking to won't attack you, but will say, oh, the author of that article didn't know what he or she was talking about, blah, blah, blah. So it's a very, very effective way that's often used. And this is the last slide. So in disagreements, when you disagree with the other person, which is fine, it's really good to make sure you understand what the other person's view is. And the good way to do this is restate the ideas and feelings of the other person or group to their satisfaction. So you can say, well, the way I understand you're saying blah, 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 blah. And the other people say, yeah, that's right. Well, first of all, you're not just coming out and attacking them. And then what you want to do is say, well, I agree with this, but I disagree with this. And so you can make your differences clear. And this is finding common ground, because seldom will you disagree with someone on everything. I mean, it may happen, but it's something you could say is, well, it appears that we agree on the major objectives here, but we disagree or differ on the details on how to get there. For instance, we agree on reducing unemployment and getting more people working, but we agree on how to get there. So at least you have your goal agreed to. What is the alternative, which we see anytime you turn on the TV today, throughout history? We start demonizing the other person. We make the other person like a devil. There's no discussion. It's shouting. No, there's no exchange of ideas. And we start labeling the other person, even if it's not true. We exaggerate. We say they're a socialist, they're a fascist, they're this, they're that, they're this and that. And, there's no point to such a discussion because it's people or groups just shouting at each other. And this isn't just in politics. This is everywhere. I mean, this could be in a meeting in a hospital, a group of nurses and doctors talking about treatment options. And if people don't express their views in a professional manner, others will view that as attacking them or their authority, and it all downgrades. So none of this will be on the exam. I just wanted to share this with you because I think it's important as we don't have classroom discussions here in an online course. In the classroom, you can get very heated discussions, but online you can too. And I've seen it in the past where people start calling each other idiots, in the discussion boxes. And I very seldom intervene. I'll say, well, let's back off a second here and take out the names. So after you finish this module, in the next module, we'll be looking at how we analyze artwork and other cultural artifacts, and then we'll jump into prehistory. And so please follow what's in D2L on that. Thank you very much.